savez que les assureurs fournissaient la liquidité.
Bonjour. Hello. Thank you very much for being here today. My name is Noémie Bisserbe. I am a journalist for the Wall Street Journal. I am a correspondent in France, and I have the honor to moderate this panel today, which will be on Europe. And we will try and answer this question: is Europe underestimating itself? We are lucky enough to have great panelists among us. Edouard Philippe, mayor of the Havre city and former Prime Minister, Tatiana Molchan, who's the General Secretary of the Economic Commission of the United Nations for Europe, Hubert Védrine, former Minister for Foreign Affairs, Thomas Claire Woodman, responsible for the EMEA region, Latin America and Canada at Morgan Stanley, and Thomas Burbel, who's the General Director at AXA. The coordinator will be Benoît Coeur from the Economist Circle, and he's also the president of the Authority of Competitiveness, and he will give a few words of introduction. Thank you, Noémie. Thank you. Hello, everyone. It will be very brief. Why? Because I think the title of this session is sufficient. Is Europe underestimating itself? Why that title? Well, because I think the program of these economic encounters do show that we are convinced that Europe is a part of the solution. Many roundtables are organized on the topic of Europe. However, we do have to observe that within economists and even politicians, not to mention journalists yet, do perceive Europe as extremely negative, and that tone was given in a way by the Draghi report about 2 years ago. You'll remember that we were with Mario Draghi on this very stage here, and a year after, and he was concluding that the implementation of his report was not going well. So the basis of that report was the observation that Europe was lagging behind compared to the US and China in terms of investment, in terms of productivity, and in terms of innovation. All of these assumptions are true. That's undeniable. However, this does not lead to a political project. So if we want to embark European companies and European citizens on a European shift, we have to be positive about it. Hence the title of this session: how can we transform a narrative on Europe which currently tends to be full of defeatism in a narrative that's a positive narrative that helps companies invest where necessary and helps citizens mobilize themselves? And I think I've said enough. We will now have the answers to these questions. Thomas Burbel, I'll give you the floor first. In your recent book co-written with Etienne Gernal from Le Point, you describe Europe as a rich, depressed person with a lot of internal issues that needs to learn to love herself. Maybe, according to you, is the biggest problem in Europe the fact that it lacks confidence in itself? Europe is not lacking self-confidence. Europe is lacking an emotional bond, an emotional attachment. If you look at the different stages of Europe's construction after the war, a miracle was created. Nations that were at war for decades are uniting, reuniting, while keeping their own diversity, with the idea that there would never be another war again. For our generation, Europe was the passportless movement. We went to study abroad. Now, if I ask my children and their friends the question, what is Europe? They tend to reply, well, why would you ask that question? And that's where the issue lies, I think. We are lacking a narrative. Secondly, the European model back then was conceived of as a model where we would do together the things we cannot do by ourselves. The mandate of Europe was never to harmonize the past and harmonize everything that's being done. The idea was always to think, what are we lacking? What cannot we do by ourselves? What must we do together? We've lost that spirit, and in that sense, Europe is nowadays perceived as a region, as a power that protects, but not as a power that innovates. It is all the more deplorable because we have everything we need. We have money, we are wealthy. Unfortunately, currently, those sums are being devoted to public debt, and that money is also going away to the US. What can we do for that money to stay in Europe, to be invested in Europe? And secondly, we have a lot of talent. We invest a lot in education, but unfortunately, our talents leave. I am very positive when it comes to Europe. We need to unite around our strengths. We need to recreate a new European narrative, and we need to build Europe as we built Notre Dame in France and the Olympic Games as well. We need to make it a new project with a strong ambition and with an implementing power that goes beyond bureaucracy, which is why the title of our book is all we need is to love ourselves. Thank you, Claire Woodman. What perspective for foreign investors when it comes to Europe, especially faced with China and the US?
I take direction from Benoit and love and optimism from Thomas. I will tell you, we need to remind ourselves, the combined market across Europe is significant. There is investment interest because there is opportunity in Europe, and there is capital that can be mobilized. We have world-class institutions in Europe and world-class companies and a skilled labor force. There is significant capital. If we look at within the financial system, there's over 33 trillion of savings within Europe, of which about 10 trillion sits in deposits. Just imagine if just a small proportion of that could be mobilized into investment to support European projects. And we've also seen this year the continuation of capital flows between Europe and the rest of the world. We're seeing in the private sector, significant and momentous mergers and acquisitions happening. We're seeing European institutions invest in the US. But Thomas is right that we do see too much investment flow directed towards the US, and some of that needs to be focused because at the moment, the backdrop is a major, major investment cycle and a huge transformation in our society driven by technology and AI. So it's not enough to just recognize the foundations and what we have to mobilize because this transformation across all of our industries, healthcare, technology, defense, requires investment and the mobilization of investment. When we look at the US and we look at China, we see that US has been able to scale much faster and look at the transformation of the US hyperscalers. We see that China is able, on a different model, to mobilize because it can centralize and direct where they want investment to go. And for me, these are the lessons that Europe needs to take away with love and with a positive optimism.
I now turn to Hubert Védrine for my third question. Faced with the constant growth of economic sovereignty and autonomy, is Europe up to the task of its ambition? Firstly, I think we'll agree on the conclusions, but I will delve into the topic differently with a first very realistic fact. So, when we talk of Europe, I do not know whom we talk about. It's like when we talk of humanity. I've never met an international community that doesn't exist. It's such an umbrella word. And when you are among economists like here, I say it every single year, we're talking here of European economic elites who do not understand why the peoples don't follow them. So we need to know what we're talking about. And we're the country in which the Maastricht Treaty ratification referendum was denounced by 1 point. I also recall that the constitutional treaty had been rejected by the French, by the Dutch, that the Chancellor Schröder had said it would not go through in Germany. And then we just pretended that question was non-existent. But I think that question still needs to be raised. Who are we talking about? And then usually we tend to think that the nice Europeans really believed in the international community. They really believed that history was over, that wars were over. In France, by entering the euro, we thought we would not need to exert any more effort. We didn't realize that it had to go along with a lot of discipline. So we believed a lot. We were very naive. So it's not just about a lack of confidence. And now if we wonder what can give the people more confidence, more trust in a new European project, that brings me to my second point, being volunteer. So the global situation, the environmental crisis, Trump and everything means that finally the Europeans are getting worried. And that's a good thing. They finally start thinking maybe we'll have to defend ourselves by ourselves, when they were able to set that option aside for a long time. Otherwise they would have been de Gaulle supporters. So there was a sudden awareness, and Trump helped us in that way, under one condition, which is that the elites decide to go further in European integration. So no particular people is stupid enough to want to leave the EU, but it would be impossible right now to have a federative treaty at the moment. So we have to get rid of that obsession. However, the economic and political leaders must manage telling European peoples that what's at stake is European civilizations, European culture. What have we invented that's better than the EU? Europe depends on others in all sectors, so we shouldn't be talking of independence that's completely unreachable, but the project should be about reducing excessive dependencies, trying to reach strategic autonomy, trying to reach a specific horizon. It's not going to happen from one day to the next. It'll take 10 to 15 years. So I think if we present that narrative, I think that the people will start thinking, okay, why not? Let's go there. But we have to make that project credible. Let's not have any slogans. Let's not insult those who want to keep their sovereignty. That's nothing out of the norm. We have to make a path credible. Us European leaders have to talk to the European peoples and show what's doable by 10, 15 years. And we have to make the goal credible, if I understand well. Well, the goal is to reconquer control over our destiny and not to depend only on North Americans and Chinese, for example. We have to maybe talk less of integration, of normalization, maybe talk less of European in some sectors, but talk more of it in some other sectors. So the type of people that are gathered here today, like every year, they have to manage being understood by those who say, well, the Draghi report, that's a good thing, but I don't care about it. So if we were able to reach a different situation, I wouldn't say that, but every year we're in the same situation. So first of all, the worry in Europe. The worry can be a good thing. It can inspire a mechanism like that described by Thomas earlier. But it's not enough to just say, trust yourself. We also have to realize we have to be awoken internally, and we have to follow a specific path. Tatiana Molchan, European regulation is seen by some as an obstacle to growth and to innovation. These criticisms, are they justified according to you? And what simplification effort could be implemented?
Much. It's good to be back here for this important discussions. But I would like to start first with the overall question that you has also posed about trust, yes, and not only about but self-confidence for Europe. And I would agree that yes, in Europe we see that Europe is underestimating itself, and I think that was quite visible also in some of the first interventions that we already had, but not for the usual reasons, yes? Because what we hear every day, we talk about military power, yes? we talk about technological powers, we talk about GDP, we talk about capital markets. But is it what's the strength in Europe? Yes, for Europe, deeper strength has also been this capacity to turn disruptions into institutions and institutions into cooperation. So the cooperation is the key word. And also, we have seen across the wider Europe, because for me, listening now to Hubert, but not only, what is Europe? Yes, what do we understand by Europe? Even geographically, I'm afraid that some of us here in this room would struggle to reply what exactly do we mean by Europe. And in my case, an organization that covers, it's called Economic Commission for Europe, but I cover 56 countries, including North America, and Eastern Europe and Central Asia as well. So we should look really at the example of some countries like those from Central and Eastern Europe, where we have seen a transition and they have learned to change laws faster than changing habits. And this is a reality that probably we need now also to embrace for the whole continent, not only in Central Europe. Because this is what we are facing now, these multiple transitions and challenges, ecological, economical, demographic. And I would like to come back maybe later on to the demographic issue, because we have an aging population and how we speak about this is really challenging. But these are my key messages. Yes, for Europe, there is an underestimation, but we should treat this without this nostalgia and self-confidence. We should look for ways of cooperation, because here's where the strength of Europe lays. Thank you.
Edouard Philippe, can we do all this? Can Europe remain competitive while preserving its social model? Since the initial question is Europe underestimating itself, do you allow me to answer that general question first? I think Europe is underestimating itself. It's likely. I'm not sure Europe knows what it wants for itself. I'm certain that in all European countries there's a lot of debate on what Europe should be, and that we do not all agree on what it could be. Very well. Is it underestimated by our neighbors? Well, according to me, our partners and our neighbors outside of Europe have quite a well-defined idea of what Europe is in the good sense of the word and the bad sense of the word. European neighbors who want to accede to Europe, they do not underestimate Europe. They do see that adhering to Europe is a promise of political stability and probably a promise of geopolitical stability as well, and economic. They know very well why they want to enter the EU, and I don't think they underestimate it, and I don't think they overestimate it either. People who do not like Europe, well, some people do not necessarily underestimate it, but those who think that they can trample it. The truth is that the US do not underestimate Europe. They did see very clearly that the US president could bring to Canossa the president of the European Commission. So this time it wasn't in Canossa, it was in Edinburgh, or right next to it. But when you're the United States, you do know that the EU is not at all the continental power that sometimes we would like it to be, and that in a political and economic struggle you could trample it. You could trample your own allies, and that's exactly what the US did when they decided to impose, and I think they did impose it, an unequal relation and a terrible treaty to Europe. When the Chinese talk of trade with the EU, I don't think they underestimate Europe at all. I think they can read through us very well. I think they can tell that when we assume a position, and if that position is completely consistent between the French and the Germans, then they just need to turn up the button where it hurts for the French so that they can create disruptions in our economic interests. I don't think they underestimate Europe, but they see it as weak. And in a way, compared to our Chinese partners, it is weak, or at least it's not not strong enough, it's not powerful enough, it's not able to exert its economic power. So I've convinced maybe 3 people up to that stage, and I want to thank you because that's a very bold choice. I will admit it, and maybe that'll be shocking to you. I do not know exactly how to answer the question you're asking when you say, can we in Europe be more competitive without changing our social model? As if European competitiveness was something that was uniform in Europe, and as if a social model was something that was uniform in Europe as well. My answer might be this one. I think us, the French, we won't be able to be more influent in Europe unless we improve our competitiveness and reform our social model. If we want the EU to be more powerful, because that's how we perceive it as an institution of sovereignty, if we want to be more influent in Europe, then we have to become stronger in France. And I would say that if we want the EU to be powerful, we have to first solve the questions that we haven't been able to solve yet in terms of funding, in terms of public debt, in terms of social model that other countries were able to solve. And I'm not saying by that that they've solved all of their issues. And I think once we've started on a good basis again, then we'll get our European influence back, which will mean we'll be able to build the Europe we want to see, a more powerful Europe, a more agile Europe, and a Europe that's better equipped to be a credible continental bloc within the discussions with the US on the one hand and China on the other hand, and while preserving our markets. Thomas Buberl, I come back to you. Claire Woodman had said it earlier, there's a lot of savings in Europe. How can we mobilize those savings to support our innovation, to make our economies more competitive, and to make sure new European champions can emerge? Well, first of all, I said earlier that we had everything we needed. We have the money, we have the talent. The only thing is now that the money is not in the right place. Let's look at the US. In the US, every single American has their 401k with a lot of investments being done in American companies, which means the US citizen is partially an owner of the American success. So what stops us from doing that ourselves here? Nothing. In the end, the money is there and we have to redirect it. Long-term savings is within banks and insurers. Currently, those savings finance in great part the public debt. So if European countries reduce their need for public debt, then we'd have capitals available. And secondly, we have to change the parameters of regulatory systems of banks and insurers so that those sums can be more easily redirected towards companies and towards productive capitals. But in Europe, if you look at how it's being done, at the moment there's a great project, that of the single market. It's been a project going on for 20 years. In any kind of company, any project lasting over 4 years will be interrupted, but it hasn't been stopped yet, and a lot of questions haven't been solved. What are the key questions? First of all, we need to be able to redirect the money. We need to create opportunities on the European scale, for example, create a sovereign fund so we can have $1 billion or more to invest in Europe so that the money and companies do not leave and go to the US. That's not impossible to do, but in order to implement it, we have to change the European system. And that's what I was referring to earlier. Firstly, we have to act together when we cannot do things alone. Right now, we're in the dynamic where we regulate our past. That's what we tend to do in the EU, and it also applies to the defense sector. Why do we take time to align, for example, French tanks and German tanks? Well, and with the when we'll miss the drones and satellites as an opportunity. And why should we do everything, 27 of us? So the question of smaller coalitions where a few members of the EU gather for questions like funding, for questions like that of investing in drones and satellites, why do we not exploit that possibility? I think in the European framework, we don't need to change anything that's not going to allow us to move faster. And so I think with more simplicity, more common sense, and with leaders that are able to act, then I remain positive when it comes to the EU.
Allez, va manger. So one of the domains where Europe is attempting to invest is AI. Trump blocked access to the Anthropic system. All foreign players were blocked from accessing Anthropic. This is raising a lot of issues. So, in your opinion, Claire Woodman, should Europe design its own AI models to remain sovereign?
So thank you for that question. And Thomas, your points were really interesting, and they relate here. This really goes to, I think, the heart of Europeans' competitiveness and the challenge that we have. When you look at the analysis and the estimates of the scale of global investment in AI, the numbers are truly extraordinary. And spending on AI solutions to deliver productivity and efficiency, that alone is expected to exceed $600 billion in 2028. Add in all of the infrastructure investment that's required, and we're into the trillions of euros and dollars. What we have seen over the last 12 to 18 months in the US is that the US hyperscalers have been mobilizing and committing hundreds of billions annually to investment through infrastructure investment. And so yes, the challenge looks daunting, if not, inaccessible. But I honestly think that it would be really wrong for Europe to therefore conclude that it's shut out and it can't be part of this transformation. It has to be part of the transformation. And I always come back to what Thomas talked about, that collaboration and partnership have to be key. We can focus on the narrow question about model development and where models are developed domestically and nationally, but there's an opportunity to leverage and collaborate, and I think that that is absolutely key, and embed our own expectations and requirements around safety, particularly for AI. I think the thing that I would focus on is the application. We need the application of AI to be embedded to continue the improvement in our healthcare, in all of our fantastic companies and industries, energy. Thomas talked about defense, which is absolutely critical for Europe as a region and a combined region. And so that's the area that I would focus on, alongside the foundational and fundamental need for infrastructure. Infrastructure investment is key. The estimates on data center capacity in Europe are incredibly small. It's estimated we have about 8 gigawatts relative to the US, which is running and investing, but at about 50 gigawatts. So AI embeddedness and application will be key for productivity and growth. And I think infrastructure is going to be key. And of course, that does mean that sovereignty matters. But there's a way to achieve that, and I think that's through collaboration and partnership.
Thank you. Hubert Védrine, je me tourne vers vous à nouveau.
Hubert Védrine, back to you. How can Europe reconcile the wish to preserve national identities and the ambition of a common fate or destiny? Well, I think the major objective is a meeting that would gather all the planned proposal programs. That is, we need to preserve the European civilization. I'm sorry, I'm a bit like, grandiloquent, but, this is what is at stake here, I'm not talking about the Western civilization, because considering the evolution in the US and Trumpism, which in my opinion will last, I'm talking about the European civilization. This is the umbrella over all the proposals. Then after that, to answer your question on a more direct note, we need to achieve a deal between European elites and people. And we have to find a sort of more stable position, more European one way, less European others. It's essential to be, it's normal to be attached to sovereignty, national sovereignty, but you have to do it smartly, collectively. So I'm absolutely convinced that if we back to the idea Jacques Delors was putting forward all the time, subsidiarity, to calm down his own departments, subsidiarity, we get the answer. And to be concrete, close on a concrete note, outside of the major historical objectives and slogans and, cliches, you need clear roadmaps. For example, the defense of Europe itself, initially, it was the Americans, who achieved peace in Europe and they initiated the European Constitution. Fair enough. Now, today, if clearly we want to make sure that one day Europeans are able to defend themselves, conferences are useless. 250 conferences have taken place and they're useless. So what would we, despite the debts, despite the reforms that Edouard Philippe talked about, and they will need to be done. So what can we put in the European pillar of the European Canadian alliance? Now, what headquarters? Today it's a U.S. general. Who would it be? So who would then give orders to the headquarters? Do we shoot down the Russian bomber or not? So now we don't. I put them forward so that I don't want to complicate things, but we have to make headways, fed up with all the slogans which are, for the last 30 years, have been repeated. So we need to preserve the European civilization, and we need roadmaps for each domain, and then we'll be able to reconcile people and elites, in my opinion. Tatiana Molchan, in view of the rise of Eurosceptic and populistic groups, how can Europe show that it remains a player for the future and is not to become a sort of a museum continent?
I think many of the politicians are looking for a solution, and you ask me to give you a reply. But I think there is an answer to that. And we should start with what I think all on this panel agreed, is that Europe underestimates itself. What does it mean? If Europe underestimates itself, it means that it's actually doing better than we think, yes? We are doing better than populist movement are talking about. And this is the most important. Europe should continue doing what it's doing, in particular, defending something like sustainability, yes? Lately, there was so much pushback, like you cannot have both sustainability and growth, economic growth, or competitiveness. Europe is not competitive because it pays too much attention to aspects like climate. All the data shows that's not so. So this is where Europe should continue to push for that. One of the most important aspects where Europe probably is not doing as well now is trust. Throughout, in particular after the Second World War, we have seen that this is what propelled and really made Europe to advance and to become really more strong together. And we should understand that trust is not a concept, an abstract, but this is a real term for economic growth. It's essential for the economic infrastructure. Societies that trust each other can reform, can invest, can adapt, and accept difficult choices. So when we have low trust in societies, then we are the ones also, or those who are promoting this low trust is the one that pays with this invisible tax on every reform. Procurement, independent regulations, and fair courts is where Europe should continue to invest, because this is what brings it real power. And I also spoke earlier about, in my previous intervention, that one area that I think we are not yet paying enough attention, in Europe in particular, is demographics. One of the biggest achievements, again, it's something to be proud of, is the longevity. We have people living longer lives. Yes, we have some data that shows those who are born after 2000 will live to 100. 50% of them will live to 100. Maybe not us in the panel, but the rest will live to 100 years. This has to be factored in. If we don't understand early enough that we should make policies and institutions to be adapted to this new demographic change, not only age-related, but we have to integrate younger people, women, migrants, or any person with disability. All of this have to be factored in, and fast. So this is my message for this, anti or populistic. Europe is doing good. It should continue and resist to that, but there are two areas where we should pay more attention, and that is to rebuild trust, and second, to pay more attention to demographic shifts. Thank you.
Édouard Philippe, je vous poserai un petit peu la même question, mais sous un prisme.
Edouard Philippe, the same question, but on a more French framework. So, what political project could reconcile the French population in Europe? Major key project, iconic project. Could this bring the rebirth of Europe? Well, clearly, yes. And I would say even that a political nation, if we talk about France, or a political construct, if we talk about Europe, is only solid if it is gathered around a project, a pride, infrastructure, industrial achievement, or collective challenge it imposes itself, be it in medicine, technology, whatever. So for the French population, for the French in Europe, is at least its Airbus and European treaties. The European embodiment, and it counts like like for any political gather or group, we need this. But of course, there are plenty of projects to be done. We do need joint common infrastructures. We have to insist to invest in elements which are essential to ensure our sovereignty, technology, defense. We said it. Innovation in many domains. Let me insist on a couple of points which, in my opinion, are feasible, which are already part of the public debate. We don't need to, they don't call for very complex concept, but in my opinion, they would have a huge impact on the European construction. I think the best or the most beautiful European construction we've achieved, is our market. This kind of a construct of a European market called the single market, sometimes which groups a lot of people with a standard of living which is noticeably above world average, and which is a great asset and richness. But we did it in a very imperfect way, and it's not finished. And therefore, the efforts we did to achieve the situation now is not sufficient, and we need more energy to complete that market. And if we complete this market truly, then it will be visible. I'm talking about borders, or I'm talking about the limitation of trades where with countries which have different regulations, and the scattering of the trade within the market, or this breaking down of national markets, leads to about 30% custom laws in goods and services. It's huge, and it's insane, to have a single market to end up having, barriers or, which are non-custom, but which are up to 30% of the value of goods. So, and the capital market. Well, I've never seen anybody in Le Havre saying to me, "Oh God, what would be great, is to have the union of capital markets." Well, nobody says that, but I'm absolutely convinced that a union of capital markets markets, and we do have the orientation. There are very smart people who said exactly what had to be done. Well, let's do it, because today there will be the unions of capital market. There will be a depth of investment for our financing for French companies that is completely new, and I don't think this represents anything negative in that sense, but not at all for the population of the member states, and I'm sure that would unlock the development of wealth and European richness and development, and we have to fight for our market as well, and our citizens will like that. Our assets is our market. Well, we have to make sure that our market is protected, not by establishing protectionism between Europe and the rest of the world, but make sure that products coming to, or goods coming to the European market do not place us in a sort of a technological, environmental, or commercial gap or retard. So 20 years ago, when we wanted to sell in China or produce in China, they would say, come and produce in China. Today, we have to realize that we have to be aware of the fact that our production are more expensive than the Chinese with technologies which are older, and therefore we're getting the backlash here. We're getting, there is, soon there is going to be like a punch in the face, and so we have to impose our partners, if they want to gain access to the European market, they have to produce in Europe, and this is the defense of the European market, to take into account elements such as decarbonation and so on and so forth, and which we think this is what's essential. And this, in my opinion, is it's already in public discussion. It's already debated. We know how to do it, roughly, but we don't do it. And I think that before jumping into complex concepts we might need, well, just do this quickly. Let's do this quickly, which will change the nature of our position in our position versus other Western power or continental power. Do not pressure us and or do not have in mind the defense of our interest, our own interest, if you see what I mean. We got 15 minutes left to take Q&A with the audience. I don't know if Europe is underestimating itself, but I'd like it to be more ambitious, which means that it has to meet two urgent topics: social and climate emergencies or urgencies. Of course, taking into account today the constraints of competitiveness, of course, of the debt, and to do so, maybe there is only one way that is to involve a minority which today is, lives on the rent and is some kind of a parasite. And if we don't want the rencontre économique not to be prohibited from the extreme right next year, we have to gather the population, regroup the population. Who would like to react to this? That's an opinion. It's a respectable opinion. I would like to share I kind of agree with part of the first half of your talk. Climate change, sovereignty, social issues, fair enough. We do a lot of things we could do better. And in the major projects I mentioned, like infrastructures, I don't doubt that we can imagine large projects that would fit in that logic. Fair enough. Now, just allow me to tell you that the leads for solutions you mentioned are leads which are being discussed in France, but they've been pushed aside elsewhere. And if we want to do things at the European level, well, we have to make sure, we have to convince our partners as well. And I'm not sure that, and I'm saying, I'm being careful here, talking about the so-called parasites, I'm not sure that we want to convince our partners. Hubert Védrine. A macro reaction as well. At the beginning of the presentation, sir, it's too dangerous to expect everything from Europe. Again, who the hell are we talking about? You know, are we talking about the Commission, the Parliament, the Court of Justice? What is it? So I think it's a bit too dangerous. You know, this so-called Europe that will never happen. So then you fuel resentment, frustration when you go like this. So for each topic, major topics, what can we do at the European level? So this is exactly what Mr. Bizaid said earlier on. We should do at the European only what we can do at the lower level. What can we do at the European level, at the national level, regional level, local level? So things in terms of levels, and you know, let's not come with unfeasible expectations, because this will fuel frustration.
Hubert's comment. I think on certain policy, we shouldn't ask like what Europe should do, and in particular when it comes to climate action. I think Europe is already a big champion on that, and we should look on the world and put the pressure on the others to follow this example. So I think we have to change the rhetorics a little bit here. It's not what Europe should do, what the world should do to come to the same standard. On social is the other way around. The situation globally, I mean, in Europe it's much better, and I can confirm that on any aspects that you would look like at, social aspects are much better in Europe altogether. The autonomy of local, regional authorities, I haven't seen this anywhere in the world. But what we need to change on social is the institution in Europe, because when they were built, they were not being foreseen for the current social structure. That is true. That is where we should work.
Oui, bonjour, merci pour vos interventions. Monsieur le Premier ministre, une question de politique fiction concrète pour vous.
Mr. Prime Minister, concrete politic fiction, September 2027, and Rafale plane ensured the safety of airspace of our European neighbors. And there is a Russian plane flying over, violating the airspace. We tried to locate him for 70 seconds. Do you say that, like Turkey, shoot him down, like they do in Turkey? I get your point, and I'm not taking it as a joke. And my answer at this stage, based on what you've just said, is to say, let's do exactly what we are already doing, because you know, the Russian craft probing the airspace in Europe, they do that on a regular basis, and we are already bringing answers to this, you know, and to deal with these entries or incursions or provocations. They do exist, and in fact, if you ask the question, it's because you know. So therefore, as I don't take this lightly, I would say my reading is that vis-à-vis the appetite for power and provocation on the Russian side, so far, well, maybe too slowly, but we've provided answers which I think are solid enough, sound enough, and which have been underestimated by Russia. Well, Russia did not expect Sweden and Finland to join NATO. That's the thing. And Russia did not expect Europe to support Ukraine for such a long period of time. And a lot of things to be said that we should do in terms of defense. We are not where we should be. I know that. I'm aware of that. But in our military capability to say Russia should not push it too far, especially for Europe and NATO countries, I think we found a firm position, and which I think has been the message has been well received on the other side of the border. Hello. I don't have a question, I just have a comment. To Mr. Berbel, he said that in Europe we've got everything and the knowledge, but there's one thing which is missing. It's the energy. And I'm surprised that in view of the quality of the panel, we didn't talk about energy, we talk about AI, we talk about defense, but energy has not been discussed. Doesn't seem to be something important for you. Thomas, you're right. Energy is indeed a crucial topic, and today Europe faces a double challenge: cost of energy and cost of labor. Again, if we focus on where are the positive points where we have competitive energy, France, that's the case. Spain, we do have competitive energy as well. And then we should say, within the same logic, what can we do together in Europe to better exploit the competitive energy in Europe? And in our states have to invest now in climate transition, which is taking place, but partly, not sufficiently, and we have to ensure interconnection between grids, to have a proper European energy market. But you're right, This topic of energy, we know we deal with it not enough, and it is an issue of dependence, and we've seen at the time of the Ukraine war, and we saw again recently the time of the war in Iran. I hope that after two call to attentions from societies, it's not just the politicians. We all have businesses, citizens, politicians. Now we have a political responsibility to understand the second call to attention to ensure this situation in Europe.
Point the gentleman made, which is why I talked about the need for infrastructure investment, because we do need to build power and capability for society and the economy.
Nous avons 2 petites minutes pour prendre.
2 minutes for one last question. There, a lady has been agitating herself in the. Sorry. Back to energy. We talk a lot about sustainability, climate change, which are noble causes, but didn't we underestimate? On the way we talked, we didn't talk about sovereignty to the European populations. When we don't talk much about that, or to the benefit of the fight against climate change, but we don't talk about sovereignty much to the people, considering maybe they're not smart enough to get it. So shouldn't we say that sovereignty is also a priority?
Can I start with this, because energy and energy cooperation is part of the work that we are doing at UNICE. And you are right, this is one of the biggest challenges for Europe. But we haven't spoken not only about energy, we have 2 other bigger challenges. Housing is also a big challenge for Europe. But coming back to the energy, the current situation that we have seen from all of the analysis is that we need indeed big investments. A lot of the infrastructure is outdated, but we have to use the digital solutions. Why? Lately, there is this narrative that AI is big on water, energy consumption, but also AI is the one that will help us save enormously when it comes to using renewable energy, because renewable energy is not constant, you cannot predict. And to calculate all of this, you need AI to help you that. So there is a lot of progress in this area. It still stays as a major challenge, but I'm confident not only because of the Strait of Hormuz, Middle East crisis, Ukraine crisis, but really because of the latest commitment of the countries that we will have a better solution in the coming year.
Thank you. Thomas, you wanted to...
Alors, cette question...
This is indeed a... Quickly we could discuss that, but careful, the topic of sovereignty is everywhere. If we yield when it comes to climate change, well, soon you will have a problem of food sovereignty, for sovereignty, so food security. So this is exactly what needs to be done, is to do a mapping of dependence, situations of dependences, and where do we want to be in a situation of sovereignty, or can we rely, or where can we rely, can we allow to be dependent on others? But there must be a balance versus others. You know, dependence in itself is not an issue, only if you depend everywhere for everything and from everybody. So we have to identify our key sovereignties we want to master, to control, and what are the others where we can afford to be in balance with other countries. Just one word. It's not my domain, but I was surprised by the number of Nobel cause concerning the climate. A Nobel cause. It's not a Nobel cause, it's a vital cause. Very much like the ecological time bomb. It's vital. Second, Thomas just said it, there is no contradiction per se with the reduction of dependence and, you know, and the issue of sovereignty. It's the same thing. There is no contradiction in say. Edouard Philippe, just words of conclusion. One, because very much like Hubert, I didn't like this notion of a noble cause. And second thing, not serious, the idea that there should be European energy policy. Because when we did the SECA, you know, we talked about the energy, you know, it was a very political issue at the time, you know. But I'm not impressed by the European energy policy for simple reasons. We don't all agree among Europeans on how to have a European energy policy. So the true policies today, well, the only positive one, it would be interconnection of grids. That's it. So that's the European policy, which might, in my view, is you know, interconnected the hubs or the grids, fine. But there is no European policy, in my opinion, which is clear-cut on nuclear energy. And there is even a problem to have a European policy on nuclear with countries which are very much in favor, who are right, and other countries who are unfavorable. It is their choice. But there is no European policy. There is no European policy to say, let's have the new SMR before the Americans and the Chinese. It's not even an objective. So when we try to agree on taxonomy and issues of finance of an energy, even if it's not appreciated by some European partners, remain decarbonated and more sovereign and controllable than others, we can't even agree, and it takes a lot of time. So in this case, don't overestimate Europe in that respect. I'm not impressed by the European policy, energy policy. We should have one. Would be great for all of us, but look at the dreadful situation Germany faced, because its energy policy was based on the almost major dependence on Russian gas. Well, it ended up in a dreadful situation, but it was not because of the European energy policy. It was probably due to the lack thereof. So let's not, you know, when I feel that I think a lot of European countries are not really willing to build or construct. Ends of conclusion. Bye-bye, thank you, have a good lunch.
Retrouver Hubert Védrine pour la dédicace de son livre Après l'Occident à la FNAC Jourdan. Merci.